Believe it or not, taking home console games on the go wasn't always as simple as popping your system out from its dock. No, you had to pray that the Wii Fit for 3DS port would get announced any day now. Back in the olden days, getting home console games on handheld systems were somewhat scarce, and if they did happen, usually came with significant compromises included free of charge. But there were rare occasions when what these games sacrificed in visuals, the extra content and quality of life changes made these a definitive way to play these classic titles. Today I want to talk about the best remasters, ports, whatever you want to call them, of beloved games stuck on the 3DS, potentially until the end of time. By the way, this list isn't going to feature any of the major remakes like Superstar Saga and Samus Returns. The way I see it, these games are drastically different from their original counterparts, while the remasters on this list for the most part maintain the same experience as the originals, but overall are the superior way to play them. First game on this list is the only one I experienced before the 3DS edition even existed. Donkey Kong Country Returns on the Wii was my all-time favorite game as a kid, so my expectations for this version were high. The most immediate difference is the removal of having to shake the controller to make DK perform certain actions like rolling and ground pounds, which are now mapped to the X and Y buttons. Although I think people over-exaggerate how bad the motion controls on the Wii version are, I get it. Button inputs are much more reliable than motion, causing misinputs and mistakes to happen less often. Also, because this is a handheld system we're talking about here, shaking the entire system would be a little, impractical, so good change. Returns 3D also adds a new mode called New Mode. Well, aren't we clever? Someone got paid to come up with this name. This raises the maximum number of hits you can take from 2 to 3, or 4 to 6 if you have Diddy Kong with you. I don't blame them at all for adding an easier mode as Returns difficulty gets brutal, especially around the end of the game. I specifically have beef with whoever designed a -2. I hope you can sleep well at night, knowing you single-handedly prevented 9-year-old me from finishing the game. The fact that New Mode is totally optional, while the challenge of the original can still be enjoyed if you choose so, is the perfect way to handle this, and should be the standard when it comes to difficulty for all Nintendo re-releases. And lastly, there's a new world with 8 exclusive levels only found on the 3DS edition. This doesn't feel shoved in just for the sake of extra content. The levels are genuinely well crafted and fit right in alongside the rest of the game. Really, the only downside to this version is that the frame rate got sliced in half, going from 60 on the Wii to 30 on 3DS. But other than that, it's straight up Donkey Kong Country Returns on a handheld, which was crazy impressive to me, especially considering this was only 3 years after the original release. If they ever do a remaster of this game, I hope they can find a way to merge the gameplay features of the 3DS alongside the visuals of the Wii version. Actually, maybe those visuals could be a little better than the Wii. It is 2024 after all. Then up next we have the game I'm experienced with the least on this list, Star Fox 64 3D. I hadn't touched much of the Star Fox series prior to making this, but I booted up 64 to gather footage for this video and really enjoyed it. Maybe a little too much, because I beat 64, and then 0, and then the original on SNES. So, yeah, I guess I'm a fan of this series now. But anyways, the most convenient change in this version is the ability to save between missions. In the original, there was no saving. If you wanted to see the game through to the end, you had to do it all in a single session, sort of like an arcade game. Not only does this make sense for a handheld system, it's just a nice change in general. Another big feature is the inclusion of gyro aiming, allowing you to tilt the controller, or the entire system in this case, to move your reticle with precision not possible with the dinky analog stick. Any game with gyro aiming is automatically a Game of the Year contender, but because Star Fox is all about landing as many shots as possible, this is an especially perfect addition. Then when it comes to difficulty options, there's a 3DS mode and an N64 mode. No way! Another Nintendo re-release with good difficulty options! I must be dreaming! 3DS mode makes the gameplay a little easier, which is great for beginners. Yes, okay. And Nintendo 64 mode retains the original difficulty, so series veterans can jump immediately into a more faithful experience. There it is. That is exactly how it should be done. Thanks to Nintendo, my will to live has been restored. This is truly beautiful. Until you realize N64 mode doesn't allow the use of gyro aiming whatsoever. Let us introduce a new innovative control scheme and lock it to the easiest mode, even though the precision offered by gyro would be even more useful when the challenge is higher. I can kinda get having it disabled by default, but removing the option entirely? That's just stupid. Whatever, man, I'm complaining about a 13-year-old game over here. Now for a change that's more widely looked down upon, which is the updated voice acting, and I have to agree with this one. A lot of the deliveries just aren't the same as the original.
My Emperor! I failed you! My Emperor! I failed you!
Now, you could argue that because the voices aren't compressed like crazy anymore, this is an improvement. But I thought the compression added a lot of charm and were an iconic part of Star Fox 64's identity. Then again, it's just a matter of preference. And with the updated visuals, saving between missions and gyro aiming, overall I would say Star Fox 64 3D is superior to the original. Next, we have the only entry on this list that surprisingly doesn't have 3D anywhere to be seen in its title. Aw, aren't we special? This version of Luigi's Mansion updates the visuals while trying its hardest to stay true to the source material and has a bunch of cute additional features. You have the option to use the original flashlight or the strobe bulb from Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon, which I'm a huge fan of. It's so sick when re-releases of older games include content or references from future games in the series. On the GameCube, the Hidden Mansion was a slightly harder version of the main game. Luigi would take twice the amount of damage from attacks, but he would also catch ghosts faster than usual, so it made it a little easier at the same time. The 3DS's Hidden Mansion is significantly better. Ghosts have increased health and enemy placements have been wildly mixed around, the location of key items have changed, some of the bosses have new attacks and more. It is really challenging, as it should be. This is a hard mode done proper. There's even co-op, where player 2 plays as Luigi. The in-universe explanation for Luigi being here is that Professor Egad, around the events of Luigi's Mansion 2, sends Luigi back in time to the first game to be tested for his appearance in Luigi's Mansion 3, which, in my opinion, is a pretty radical detail. They could have just thrown him in and said, don't ask any questions, he's simply the player 2 character. But they went above and beyond, making a creative little story that ties all three games together. Respect! Now you could argue that the game's art style was superior on GameCube. Once again, I think it's just a matter of preference between the charm of the original or the up-to-date models of the remaster. But the mansion itself has been very faithfully recreated and still carries that creepy atmosphere, with the major exception being the gallery. Seeing this after playing the 3DS edition first seriously messed me up. Now, please, hear me out. I think the controls of the 3DS are better. Our glorious savior gyro controls return so you can easily tilt the poltergust up and down. And if you hold down the B button, you can swap between standard and sidestep controls without having to change it in the pause menu. Now when it comes to the controller, the GameCube is inconceivably better than the 3DS. It just feels so much better to catch ghosts with the GameCube analog stick instead of the 3DS circle pad. That and the C-stick on the new 3DS models aren't that reliable. I know I was just complaining about the 3DS circle pad, but I feel moving the poltergust would work better with the circle pad Pro, as kinda ugly as it is. If Nintendo were to re-release Luigi's Mansion in HD, I see them just throwing the GameCube edition on the eShop, instead of going through the trouble of reworking the 3DS version for a couple quirky extras 90% of players wouldn't care about. Which is a shame, because I think this is the better version of Luigi's Mansion, only held back by the system it's on both visually and control-wise. Then we have a series of games with one notable standout. 3D Classics were a bunch of NES games remade for the Nintendo 3DS in 2011, and I would argue every single one of these is better than their originals. Urban Champion got this really awesome camera angle feature, and Kid Icarus got updated backgrounds. But the one game I believe benefited the most would be Kirby's Adventure. This is one of the most ambitious NES games ever. It redefined what games on the system could be like. But it came at a price. This game experiences slowdown like crazy whenever there's too much going on. And by too much, I mean whenever there's like 2 enemies on the screen. But, since Kirby's Adventure 3D was built with 3DS hardware in mind, it runs flawlessly without a single slowdown or stutter in sight. What really sucks is that the original Kirby's Adventure is already on the Nintendo Switch Online NES library. You know, the one with slowdowns and stutters in sight. And they can't just throw the 3D Classics version on Switch because, oh wait, where's the 3D? It's so unfortunate how the 3D Classics version fixes the slowdown, and yet is stuck on the 3DS most likely forever. Really sucks how we found a solution to this problem, but we lost it again. Lame. Now, before we get to the end of this list, I want to shout out an honorable mention, that being Metal Gear Solid 3D Snake Eater. This version added some features from the previous entry, Peace Walker, with the most prominent one being crouch walking. To anyone who's unfamiliar with the series, this doesn't seem like a huge deal, but this is the only official version of Snake Eater to have crouch walking, and it's so hard to live without it. But that's not all, because there's Yoshi hiding all around the game. The amount of times the Yoshi and Metal Gear universes have collided is concerning. Now, the reason this is only an honorable mention is because the performance for this version is rough. Visually, it's phenomenal, looking nearly identical to the PS2 release, but the frame rate constantly jumps between, I want to say 15 to 20 frames per second, definitely not ideal. And really, because the only change of importance in Snake Eater 3D is crouch walking, I don't know if that's enough to justify this frame rate. You can mod new 3DS models to run this game better, but if we're bringing mods into the conversation, you can just get crouch walking on the PC version, so yeah. Is this the secret definitive edition of Metal Gear Solid 3? Probably not, but it's one of my favorite remasters that are stuck on the 3DS. And last, but definitely not least, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time 3D. As everyone knows, Ocarina of Time for the Nintendo 64 is the highest rated video game in history, with a couple of minor complaints. It is often agreed that the 3DS somehow managed to make it even better. The models and environments have been updated while staying true to the N64 concept art, and it looks gorgeous. Not to mention the frame rate has actually received an upgrade with an increase from 20 to 30. There's the Master Quest from the GameCube release, which is essentially a remixed hard mode that offers a completely new playthrough. Sheikah stones have been placed around which offer optional hints as to where to go next. The most infamous part of the game, the water temple, was made significantly less frustrating with just a few small changes. And most importantly, gyro aiming. The biggest complaint I've seen when it comes to Ocarina of Time 3D is that it's too bright, with the atmosphere in areas such as the Forest Temple and the final Ganon fight not being as strong. This is a complaint that I agree with, but also understand why it had to be this way. Because this remaster wasn't created to be played on a large TV screen, but a tiny 3DS display. They just had to make everything brighter to account for that. There's some other stuff like the blood in the game being censored or removed entirely, but I'm not gonna get too hung up on that. Ocarina of Time 3D isn't perfect, but 95% of it was handled exceptionally well. I finished the N64 version for the first time this year. While playing through the 3DS version, it was genuinely hard to find complaints for this video. It's clear the development team behind it made sure to treat one of the best games in history with the care it deserved. Also, I was originally going to include Majora's Mask 3D on this list as well, but right as I was about to, I looked at the moon and he asked me, was Majora's Mask 3D a bad remake? And I was like, I'm not too sure? So, that wraps up this list of the best remasters stuck on the 3DS. Not all the entries on this list are necessarily my favorite way to play these games, but the extra content they offered managed to have them stand out and make them worth checking out. And more importantly, these remasters, ports, whatever you call them, despite not having the sharpest visuals, preserved these titles and then allowed a new generation of people the chance to experience them. And I think that's beautiful. Who needs a solid frame rate when you have the Luigi camouflage?